I'm not a specialist in Roman or Greek history. I have been a college teacher, have had almost 25 years of experience teaching this, and the benefit of having learned and studied under Professor Romila Thapar and Shireen Ratnakar, to whom I owe a lot for having generated interest in this paper. Okay, and uh, the topic that Ishan has asked me to speak on is Greco-Roman slavery. And when we talk about slavery, what immediately comes to mind is, you know, I mean, in Hindi we say dasita. We look at how, this complete loss of right, where the slave is seen to be the property of another, becomes the basis of a characterization of what is to be a slave. In the world of antiquity, for example, the slave was described as an instrumentum vocale, that is an instrument with a voice, and was similar to or characterized as similar to the beast in terms of work, as it were. So very importantly, we get to know about slaves, and particularly slave mode of production or slave social formation, or a dominant form of using slave labor as the basis of production in the Greco-Roman society. But prior to that too, we get to hear about slaves in the Mycenaean times. We do see pictures from the Mesopotamian times of people with pictographic things of people with tied hands, and we really kind of do not know how to describe this because we do not kind of see it thereafter. But in the Mycenaean times, definitely we do get to hear of this early evidence of enslavement of some form. And in the Greek world, for example, if you read scholars like Anthony Andrews, he, for example, talks about how we, encounter debt bondage just before the point of its abolition. And then we have the new form of organizing labor, a very important source of supply that comes to the city-states of Athens, Corinth. Of course, in the context of Sparta, you have the use of helotry. And with that begins the evidence of slaves to be seen as, the a mode of the instrument of production, the force of production to manage agriculture, to do household work, to be part of craft and industry, to be part of mining and a range of other activities. That's when we begin to see slaves. But that does not mean that slavery was the only form in which labor was organized, which is another thing that we will be looking at in a little bit from now. But slavery becomes an important way of organizing production, definitely in Athenian Greece. And to some extent, if you look at look at the history of Athens and look at the history of Sparta and Corinth, then you can see the different ways in which, even the notion of controlling labor was similar yet dissimilar between Corinth and Athens. But in the context of Sparta, it was helots. So, for example, scholars say that, the reason why there was so much of rebellion in Sparta was because because helots were more or oppressed than slaves were. Now, why does this kind of conversation come to become part of the world of antiquity is also something that we need to understand to make sense of this very important phase in which, slaves as the systematic subjection of individuals, their loss of right, the fact that they become a property of another, that become part of the process of production and reproduction in the world of antiquity. Now, it's important to see that, there are very many descriptions and definitions in which scholars have characterized slavery, but one very important description which I would like to present is Patterson's. And for Patterson, for example, Patterson describes slavery as a condition in which there is a complete institutionalized alienation from the rights of labor and kinship. Now, so slaves, so one, as I said, that we encounter debt bondage, which is a precursor to slavery at the point of its abolition. And then we know that, Solon, who seemed to be a reformer, but yes, that Solon, I mean, we know that there was a period when you had the return, the beginning of Iron Age, the return of the oikos, the transition in Rome, then the Greece, then the emergence of tyrants, and then finally the transition to early society where you begin to see institutions coming. And it is with Solon's time that we begin to see the challenge of the domination of the lower groups in society by the well-to-do and the powerful, and then the Horoi stones as markers of their subordination begins to kind of become the basis of the call for rights, the call for doing away with debt bondage, and then the doing away of debt bondage, A, and B, the beginning of what we call the moving towards the formation of the Athenian constitution. So when we talk about slavery, we also need to connect it to the emergence of political formation, the world of Greece, particularly in the context of Athens. And in Athens, for example, the fact that Athens is also historically, and that's why Finlay's work, which talks about the political developments in the Greek world, a very important, interesting, thin reader to read, to look at the connection between democracy, between participation, the formation of institutions, and the questions of rights in the world of Athens. Simultaneously, we also see on one hand the coming up of the up on the hill, the pinks, the meeting every day, the fact that Athens was seen to be a direct democracy where everybody participated. But we also know that lots of writings by scholars have shown that only those citizens who had time, luxury, who were well off could actually participate in it. And so when we so one, we saw debt bondage and then the emergence of slavery. Then we see how in the transition from early Athens to classical Athens, we come to a point where the relationship between the use of slaves and the freedom of the citizens of Athens get to become represented as an important mechanism or relationship of establishing the case where all but the poor owned slaves, and to own slaves became also part of status. It also became not just a matter of status, but also became, as we already have talked about it, the need for the labor to take care of agriculture, housework, etc., etc. Now, for example, if you read Anthony Andrews, who talks about attitude to slaves, he says that you really cannot make any easy generalization about the attitude towards slaves in the world of Athens, in the Athenian period. Athens was emerging as a democracy. The freedom of the citizen and the uh, securing of slaves became the basis of also the resolution of the problem of the fact that citizens had rights. They did not really belong in the same way as the well-off, as the ones who participated, who were the demagogues, who in the later period of classical Athens also become part of dominating the dominating the decision making, and then of course the democracy petering out. But in the early period of the making of democracy, the emergence of Athenian democracy, of course, democracy kept out slaves, kept out foreigners, kept out, foreigners who were called metics, kept out women, and of course, slaves had no rights whatsoever. But so slaves became the polar opposite of citizenship, in the sense, so for citizens their rights, so it was, one was the rule of slaves in economic terms, the other was the ideological importance of slaves, for example. And you can see this ideological importance of slaves in this sense of how, Finlay, for example, says that in a broad sense, slavery was basic to Greek civilization. And without it, in fact, the whole society would be dislocated. And it would actually have taken off the leisure of the upper classes of Athens and Sparta. Now, while one talks about this as coming into being, it did not mean that slaves. It was also possible for people to very easily slip into a position of becoming slave. For example, Greeks of classical times, it is mentioned, ran the risk of being reduced to slavery. They were captured in war, and even in some instances of cities where, which were captured, men and children were killed, wives were enslaved. And there were also there's also mention of how slaves were secured because of inability to pay debt, and therefore family members were sold into slavery. This form of selling family members into slavery is something that we see even prior to the Greek times, as it were. Now, in terms of attitude to slavery and in terms of the ideological importance of slavery, apart from its economic importance, one can also say, for example, if you think of an Aristotle or a Plato, both of them look at manual labor as denigrated, as unfit for as unfit for human beings, and as only fit for barbarians and for slaves. And therefore there was this notion of theory of slavery as good, as just for people without nationality, and therefore it as being right for them to be enslaved. um, uh, Aristotle in his Politics, for example, talks about the reason why statesmen were good in the art of warfare was because they could become master of the enslaved. When we talk about Greek culture, when we talk about Greek writing, when we talk about the background in which the perspective of slavery was becoming the norm, in terms of both domestic use in the mines, use by the state, use in use in every walk of life. And in fact, it was not the distinction between the slave and the free was not on the question of whether somebody was doing this work or that work. Both slave and free could be doing the same kind of work. The distinction was basically around the status of the person rather than the status of the job. So very clearly, slavery meant that people did not have um, the right to their labor's profit, which went into the pocket of the master, and the slave was virtually a property of the owner. But that's a significant distinction that we need to kind of keep in mind when we talk about the slavery in Greece, the slavery in Greece. So the attitude to slaves also was defined by what was the kind of work that the slave was doing. For example, the domestic slave was on good terms with the master, because there was also there was a possibility of manumission, and this concept of manumission becomes much more visible by the Roman times. There's also mention of how slaves, when they were walking on the streets of Athens, could not be kind of distinguished from free people because of the way they were better dressed. Some of them were even better dressed than free men. There's also the mention of some slaves getting freedom, and they're becoming important in terms of the city states and their presence there, as it were. Now, the nature of slavery in Athens was very different from the nature of slavery or subordination, or the kind of control that they had over them. In Sparta, the helots were thoroughly slaves. They were like slaves. They were called the doula, And in Athens, for example, Anderson mentions that Critias, Critias, was an admirer of the Spartan system, was nearer the mark when he said that in Sparta the free were more free and the slaves were more fully slaves than elsewhere. And so, therefore, the brutality of the Spartan system is said to have been the reason for the large number of Helot rebellion. Now, this kind of rebellion we see in the Greco-Roman world in the Roman period, the Spartacus rebellion, the Eunice rebellion, etc., which I'll talk about in a little bit from now. So in Athens, the slave system the slaves system was very different. In the laws of wartime, for example, slaves could even own property. And have cattle. Slave marriages were recognized. Slaves were seen very similar to the kind of rights that they had in the archaic period. Now, that was not the case in Athens. In Athens, slaves were the property of the owner. In Corinth and in Aegina, for example, they that trade and they were restricted to some economic activities. Now, so so slavery was not. Athenian slaves was, in some senses, the classical evidence of slavery that we talk about as part of the Greco-Roman slavery, whereas in Sparta it was helotry, and in the context of the other part that I said, wartime, there were different rights that these slaves had. Now, the next part that I'd like to also talk about is, what were the source of slaves? Now, the reason for moving towards slavery was seen to have been because one's debt bondage was made unlawful, which was, of course, the rebellion that had happened that Solon was faced with. Then you needed to have other forms of labor that would then take care of agriculture, A, and B, working in the mines, and also though the elite who could afford to have people work as domestic slaves, also as craft, artisan, etc., etc. Now, the main source of slaves primarily came from slave markets in the east, and there were also captives from the barbarian wars that were sold by the captors. In fact, Herodotus talks about Thracian parents selling their children into slavery. When Finlay in his article asks, was Greek civilization based on slave labor? He remarks that with little exception, there was no activity, private or public, pleasant or unpleasant, that slaves did not perform. And therefore, the question was not about work, but about the status of the worker that made the difference. So you could have the slave and the free person stand side by side and work as a mason in the city. The distinction was basically that one was being made to work by a master who owned him, and therefore he did not have a right to the wages at the end of the day, while the other was a free man. And so Aristotle, for example, points out that the condition of the free man is such that he does not live for the benefit of another. In Greece, too, over a period of time, as the polis expanded, the colonies, trade grew, agriculture began to rely heavily on slavery. Free citizens also, of course, worked alongside, as I just said, in manufacturing as masons, alongside where slaves were employed. In fact, Aristotle, talking about property, says that the first and the most necessary kind and the most manageable one is man. And describing the qualities of the slave, he says, for example, that those who cultivate land must ideally be slaves, and that they should not be spirited in temperament, and that they should not be from one people. So early in human history, we already have this notion of how the best way to prevent rebellion, and this probably was a very important reason, apart from, of course, the repression that helotry was in the Spartan context, that you have in Athens a very well worked out system of slavery. It was only a second best option for Aristotle to have barbarian bondsmen of the same of a similar character working. Even Plato, who was a radical in the Republic, believed that believed in the continuation of slavery. So and in his laws and passages, in fact, he talks about the need to legitimize by way of law what was practiced and to give the owners the right to rule over slaves. Slaves are described as inert means of production, deprived of social and legal rights. And it was the establishment of this slave economy in mining, agriculture, crafts, that significantly helped build the vibrant city civilization, the glitter of the cities of the polis civilization, the city states of the Greek world initially, and then Rome thereafter. And if you read Perry Anderson, you will see this as this polar difference between the freedom of one and the servitude of the other in terms of slave and free as an important characterization of the meaningfulness of it. Now, when we talk about slavery in Greece, it's also particularly in Athens, there is a lot of debate on this question of. So we know that that slavery has become a system, that there are laws about it, and laws about slaves, I'll just talk about it in a bit from now. There is a law of hybris, which is much contested. A scholar by the name Nick Fisher has written extensively about it. The other important area of debate about slavery in Athens is, or the meaningfulness of slavery, is the connect between slavery and democracy in Athens. And this is an area of much debate. Early writings, in fact, see a connection between slavery and democracy, and of slavery and democracy as being two sides of the same coin. For example, there's something that, if you read Finlay's articles, if you read Anderson's article, you will see a great deal of, representation of this argument, which is where I have understood this from. Athenian democracy, for example, in classical Greece, is also cited as a classic case for the flowering of democracy as realizable and possible because of the presence of slaves. That is one set of, so slavery, freedom, citizens' participation in democracy, and that is realizable. Whereas some other scholars contest this and do not agree for a direct relationship between the two, and instead argue for very, very, do not kind of not only not agree, but question this and look at the sizable presence of citizens and the role of the citizens as a very important contributing element to the making of democracy. And as I said, that democracy in Athens, I mean, Finlay, for example, says that it's a direct democracy, and it was possible because of the geographical nature of Athens, a very small unit, as it were, populationally not very large, and therefore it was possible. But even in that, for direct democracy to actually be there, it's utopian to imagine for everyone to have participated in that. But a sizable number of citizens would have participated in the making of laws, in the making of decision in the initial period, and gradually we see that assembly becomes controlled in the phase of post the Periclean period. You see a big change, and then of course when the demagogues become important, they virtually kind of control the institutions, as it were. Now, so politically speaking, also, democracy is not something that was so inclusive at this stage. Although there is a celebration of Athenian democracy, and that is something that we have grown to understand. But we do know that women were kept out, slaves were kept out, foreigners were kept out, and metics, foreigners were kept out. And we also know that, not every citizen could have afforded to partake in the decision making or in the activities of the assembly. And that's where, the size of the, I mean, E.M. Wood and her work, E.M. Wood's work in terms of, of Athenian democracy as the role of the citizen and its important meaning there, and the questioning and problematizing of this democracy and slavery relationship is also an important story to read. But no doubt that slavery in Greece produced a situation where there was complete lack of freedom for a section of uh, people who we classify as slaves, and at the same time also produced this very fine moment of history where liberty, creativity, the genius of human possibilities, sculpture, writing, poetry, drama, talk about it, all of this grew to become of a great scale as never before in the world, or in the city state of Athens. But liberty and slavery were also polar conditions, and were also, as Anderson puts it, a structural condition for the citizens' absolute liberty. While and by the time of the Roman period, this citizens' absolute liberty and the complete subordination and subjugation of a set of people who were but instrumentum vocale with no rights, who could work, who had very different uh, kind of lives of, who had very different um, kinds of lifestyles. For example, if you look at slaves working in the silver mines, they had terribly difficult conditions. While when you compare them to the domestic slave, as I just said, that they were well dressed. So there, even among slaves, you see there is a variety of differences in terms of their, uh, in terms of their conditions. So now this difference in their condition also has an ideological element. And this ideological element is also an important aspect which built into or forged the cementing of slavery as a social institution, as a political and social reality in the world of antiquity. Okay, majority of citizens could barely participate in the debate and decision making of Athenian democracy, but nonetheless, they felt that unlike the slave, they were free, and so for scholars such as Nick Fisher, who argue that the concept of citizens is free, in fact, provided the basis for even the poorest of the poor citizen feeling the case that they belonged to the polis. Okay, so polis culture, although it was not it was not inclusive in terms of everybody having rights in the same way, in terms of being propertied or in terms of being politically involved. However, ideologically, the presence of the slaves, the use of the slaves, of course, very importantly, most importantly, an economic formation, also contributed to an experience of freedom, which, as Nick Fisher says, would not kind of have been feasible. Demosthenes, for example, makes the point from in classical Athens that it was contrary to law that a man abuse a citizen in Athens. Okay, now and that is a significant part of the historical development here. That free men, however unfortunate they may be, however poor they may be, they had control over their bodies. Right? They were free, unlike the slave who was the property of another. So Nick Fisher, in another recent article which is called Hybris, a recent article which is called Whose Honor? Hybris, Slavery and the Athenian Law. Once more, Fisher in an earlier writing had talked about hybris status and slavery, and of slaves who had no right, who were similar to animals. However, it was strange that the law of hybris, of dishonor to man as not acceptable, was something under which even the slaves were protected. Not only were the slaves protected, if you really want to read that, this article is very useful. This article that I just talked about whose honor hybrid slavery and Athenian law once more. Women are also included in that. Slaves are included, and uh, basically this is talking about um, talking about rights to a set of people who actually did not have any rights in Athenian society in classical Greece. Okay, and so far, Fisher asks, is this a coexistence of slavery and humanity, or was this a case of an underpinning of, was this an ideological underpinning within the framework of slavery? Now, there's a very important question, an argument that he picks up, because this law, in this recent article he shows, is something that, there's a debate about between him and another scholar, in which it comes out that, this is something that happens during the period of Solon, and we do know that the early period of Solonian reforms were not exactly democratic reforms. They were about containing the opposition, the struggle against the aristocracy, the elite, about land being lost, and therefore, at this point, slaves were very few. So in the making of this law of hybrids, there's also the mention of women. There's also the mention of slaves. And therefore, Fisher argues, can we actually say that the law of hybrids in some senses was in some manner some expressive power, right? Basically, in terms of protecting a lot of people who had no rights, but making citizens and making citizens aware of how much of of repression, how much of subjugation is possible, beyond which restraint uh, is uh, to be made. And so, was this in some senses putting a restraint on the behavior, on the conduct of citizens' attitude towards slaves? Is a question that he asks. But what I find very interesting is that in a society where people had no laws, and in a society, in a slave society where slaves were a property of another, who could be freed only when they either died, or terrible deaths, or when the master took pity on them and gave them freedom. Even in that society, you have the making of a law. This law of hybris is interesting to my mind, because if you look at colonial India too, if you look at how laws are made in a subjugated, colonial society, where how can a subject colonial person expect to be free, be given rights? But that's the contradiction. Now, that contradiction, to my mind, seems to be there also in the making of this kind of a law. I do not know how this goes, but it's an interesting connect that came to my mind when I was doing this. Yes, Finlay also talks about how the growth of freedom and the expansion of slavery, in fact, went hand in hand. Now, the growth of freedom and the expansion of slavery went hand in hand. And it's important to understand this, because as scholars like Osborne point out, that it is the presence of slaves that in fact sustained or represented or made a case for some semblance of equality for the Athenian citizens, so to speak. So we see that apart from Nick Fisher, you also have Osborne, and you also have Finlay talking about the connect between slavery and democracy, and how freedom and slavery went hand in hand. Slavery and democracy came together, and the contestations that took place in the world of Athens, brought about this debate to the fore. Now, the cost of the slave, the color of the slave, the region of the slave, all the skill of the slave. These are also other areas that one can talk about. And when we talk, we see that slaves came from very many different parts of the Mediterranean. And as I said, the Thracian could sell his child into slavery because of being indebted. And so on and so forth. So, there were slavery as compared to the slavery that we see in the period of commercialization, colonies, and colonial plantations, where, the question of color, the region, also becomes the basis of, race, privilege, power, and subordination, and slavery. Also, in terms of racist theories, come into being in a later period in the history of the world, is not something that one can talk about at this point. Anybody ran the risk of being reduced to enslavement, and enslavement was a real fear, and was a real fear because one was there were slave markets, and then there were slave traders, and there was this fear of children being picked up, of somebody being of little ones being picked up. And in the later period, we by the Roman period, in fact, one very major area from where slaves, slave children were picked up is, children, and this is an area in which a whole lot of new writings have come, about which I shall talk about in a little bit from now, where in fact lot of young children born out of wedlock, born out of relationships between elite and the slave women, and so on and so forth, are also seen to have been picked up and become part of slave trade. Okay, that's something that is an area that I'll talk about in a little bit from now. Now, the next part that I want to do, so slavery in the world of Greece is very closely connected with Polish civilization, Greek culture, the emergence of the ideal of direct democracy, of culture, of what then becomes Hellenic culture, as a Greco-Roman civilization develops. Now, compared to in the Greek world, of course, the size of the land holding, uh, the nature of colonial development, the use of numbers of slaves for agriculture, all of this was on a smaller scale. It's in the Roman period that we actually see the elaboration of the slave system in what is called latifundia, and then we see those large estates in which thousands and hundreds and thousands of acres with large numbers of slaves owned by the elite becomes a characteristic of of the world of antiquity. Now, so in the period of the in the period of the Athenian times, uh, the use of slaves was not on the scale in which we see in the period of the Roman Empire. Of course, slavery as a system was already well ensconced, well settled, but the kind of deployment of slaves in terms of overseers and the kind of plantation agriculture with the absent owner who lived in Rome. This kind of development is something that we see in the later period. Now, I will shift my attention now to the Roman Republic and the Empire. And when we talk about Rome, just like we talked about Greece, where we see the emergence of the Greek polis, the emergence of Athenian democracy, Spartan milocracy, the oligarchic regime in Corinth, and the other very many political formations that straddle the polis civilizations. In the context of Rome, the kind of development that we see is of Rome becoming a republic, and for this, a very nice book, a very old book, but very meaningful book, is one by Geza Alfuldi. Of course, Perry Anderson's book chapter is also very useful. But Geza Alfuldi talks about how Rome uh, as a republic secured the empire, and Rome as a republic also expanded, and it is so when we talk about Rome, it's a very big shift, because we are not talking about city states and polis civilizations of the Greek kind, but we are now talking about, both in temporal and geographical terms, the Roman Empire as huge. Of course, the Roman Empire was not the geographically the largest. It's the Persian Empire that was the largest in terms of territorially speaking. But Roman Empire is something that we have, read about in terms of it being not only large, but of its conquest of Egypt, of its first Italy, and then its moving towards the north, and beyond that, reaching right up to the Near East. And this large area that became the Roman Empire was secured by Rome as a republic. Uh, and it is from this republic that we also see the strength of the empire growing. For example, Rome sourcing its grain from Egypt, trading olives across the oceans, it reaching the shores of India. The fact that you have the periplus of the Erythraean Sea, you have Strabo mentioning some 120 ships set to India itself by the first century BC, and of if you look at P.A. Brunt's figures of in Italy itself, something like by 225 BC, some 4.4 million free people and 60,000 slaves, which by 43 BC, that is the first century BC, Brunt estimates that it has now become something like 4.5 million free people and 60,000 and 3 million slaves. If you read Perry Anderson, you'll see the waves and waves of expansion of the Roman Republic and the securing of slaves from the First Punic War, the Second Punic War, in the form of 75,000, 30,000, from Epirus in form of 150,000, and how this notion of republic, conquest, and securing of slave population from the different regions that Rome expanded onto. First, the region of Gaul, the region first in the area of Rome, Italy itself, then the area of Gaul, and then beyond that, as it were, the Goths, and so on and so forth. Okay, now, so with that, we have, for example, the perspective that it is this transition of Rome that actually captured the attention of scholars of antiquity, and it leading them to suggest that Rome was actually a slave society. Now, we also know that this euphemism of all roads lead to Rome. Now, this is because Rome in this period of Republic virtually kind of got was this small, patrician elite, the purple robe, which accommodated a section of the plebeians. They had, wherever they conquered, they let initially the local groups work, and then gradually, this process of what we call Romanization begins. And with that, we see, the beginning of a crisis in the republic, because the republic came out of a very early political system that could not obviously straddle this growing empire, the ambitions, the aspirations, the competitions that also produced a U2 Brutus story, and the emergence of a Julius Caesar, and then, of course, the emergence of an Augustus, who becomes the first princeps, and who then usurps the republic, uses the republican first princeps, consul, principle, and then that then becomes the phase of the beginning of the empire. Okay, with that, then we know more of expansion, then Pax Romana, Rome at peace with the world, peace with itself, so-called looking within, but actually speaking, that was a period when you had greater developments, as it were, in terms of trade, commerce, culture, contests, etc. Now, it is it is the Roman phase that where we see where we see the growing of slavery as a large um, way of organizing production and slave mode of production, as for example, some scholars put it as becoming the mechanism of managing the cultivation of the latifundia. Okay, now the debate that is there among scholars is whether slaves came from conquest or slaves came from birth. Now, one is the early writings of Keith Hopkins, who has written this very interesting, very useful, wonderful work called Conquerors and Slaves, where he talks about how, with the expansion of Rome, gradually total production, largely and essentially, began to be based on slave labor. And it is he who, in fact, also says that it's reasonable to describe the Roman economy, at least in Italy, as a slave economy. And this and it is slave labor that became the basis of the production of large surpluses for the ruling groups, and thus becomes that very important characterization of the slave social formation as the basis of the Roman antiquity of Roman civilization, as it were. In the Roman period, as I just gave you the figures from Brandt, there are other scholars who have recently written, who of course, contest some of the early writings and argue that, the early writings talk about conquerors and slaves, and that as conquest grew, the slave numbers, waves and waves of slaves got to be available from different regions as Rome expanded its frontiers and consolidated its empire. And then when post-Pax Romana, the closing of the borders and the problems of, how much of slaves could come from breeding, and then that becoming a problem, and that as resulting in creating contradictions within, resulting in the transition, the debate that is another story altogether, which I'm not dealing with in this discussion, as it were. But we have scholars, for example, Kyle Harper, who's written this book called Slavery in the Late Roman World, AD 275, 425, Cambridge University Press, 2011, who in fact, it's a very recent, it's recent, it's 11 years, 13 years old now, but it's a very interesting additional, additional source of information, nuancing our knowledge of the past in terms of slavery, in terms of the gender dimensions of it, and in terms of how, this breeding of slaves, not only the breeding of slaves, but even in the 4th and the 5th century, the fact that, women who were in the reproductive age were not given manumission, and it is basically menopausal women who were given manumission, and that there was a great deal of encouragement to birthing slave children. And so this is a lot of very interesting information in terms of records that Harper has picked up to provide us with a gender dimension in terms of looking at how slavery, although the borders closed, the conqueror slaves expansion mode got to be kind of saturated, but that in the by the 4th, 5th centuries, actually you see the encouragement of birthing as a very important strategy of increasing the numbers of slaves, and that the numbers of slaves were not as low as posited, nor were the numbers as large as posited for the earlier period. Now, of course, this is a matter of debate that scholars have. I'm not a specialist, but for me, what was very attractive when I read this is the gender dimension to the story of a largely economic, economic field that one has primarily been focused on. So Keith Hopkins's work is being contested in terms of these writings or Perry Anderson's work now in terms of these monographs that are talking about developments in the 4th and the 5th centuries, and they are talking about how in Christianity, I mean, earlier it was said that the relationship between Christianity and a better way of treating the slaves, and not the contradiction between slavery and Christianity. Even that is being kind of relooked at, to say that yes, during the Constantine period, for example, people were asked to have their children and give them away, but I mean, another set of debates I don't want to get into now, but if somebody asks a question, I'll come back to it. But in the Roman period, just like we saw in the Greek period, there is a whole body of writing. All this writing that I'm talking about is writing that are on the basis of my readings of Anthony Andrews, M.I. Finlay, Perry Anderson, Oswin Murray, some bit of Osborne, Nick Fisher, etc., etc. I'm not a specialist in Greco-Roman history, so I share I'm just sharing whatever little I know in terms of my teaching this paper over 20 years. So cat also, just like we saw in the context of Greece, in Rome too, we have the mention, we have multiple texts which talk about, slavery. For example, Cato, who's also a slave owner in the 2nd century BC, in his work on agriculture, has a certain take on how worn out slaves should just be let be in the town center to take care of themselves. And then, if they recovered and if they were capable of work, they could be kind of brought back to labor in the fields again. Okay, so you can see this very beast like treatment of the human being that we see in the world of antiquity, something that we are not unfamiliar with. Okay, slavery in Rome. Therefore, the notion of the notion of the treatment to be meted out to the slave, on that too there is a great deal of just enough so that he can work, so that he's not sleepy. So starving the slave, punishing the slave. There's lots of writings about that also, that one can see from the period of Rome. Now, slavery in Rome also involved large estates, hundreds of thousands of acres, the latifundia, and on one hand, you had, extremely oppressive work in terms of the mines, where 40,000 were workers in completely gruesome conditions working. There's also this notion of this proverb which says that all slaves are enemies. So the way to deal with an enemy, obviously, not in a friendly way, but also to treat them as befitting of just somebody to labor, to be productive, just that instrumentum vocale, as was kind of suggested by earlier authors, as it were. Okay, the fact that there are people who are fit to only be slaves, that it was their nature to be enslaved. There's a continuity here in terms of characterization, as it were. And so, so I mean, all slaves are enemies, and probably that came from the argument that Keith Hopkins makes of war, war and conquest and conquerors and slaves. Keith Hopkins also has a very nice article where he talks about a very intelligent slave who, kind of takes his master for a ride. Aesop table, this kind of story of Enid. The master asks him to cook, and he goes off with his friend to the bath, and when he asks him to cook grain, and he cooks, and then he goes off, and when he comes back, he asks where is the food, and then lo behold, there is a grain. And so there are these trick stories. So it's not like as if the down below stories are not recoverable. This particular story that is an article by Keith Hopkins is an interesting story about of how the exact to cook a grain was kind of So you are obeying and yet you are not obeying. Kind of representation comes to the fore. Now, scholars such as the scholars such as Kyle Harper, who has in fact worked on the 4th century AD, in fact talks about how slavery not only slavery was seen to not only have become difficult with the reduction in wars post Pax Romana, but what one also sees is a shift to other ways of securing slaves, and that is where she says that a larger number of female slaves and the encouraging of biological reproduction as a mode to reproduce slave society began to become significant, right? And she's, for example, there's a quote that I'm giving from her. She says that for the Romans, birth into slave status depended entirely on one's mother. For the Romans, followed the principle of partus ventrium sequitur. Offspring follow the womb. So an enslaved mother bore children who were slaves, while a free woman birthed free children regardless of the status of the father. Right? And so she says that though we do not have quantifiable data to help us determine the relative importance of various channels that went into the making of Roman slave supply, yet another scholar, right, that she quotes from is Noel Lenski, who in fact says that birth was definitely a very important part of securing slaves. I mean, so this is a recent addition in terms of how the procurement of slaves. So earlier scholars did talk about slave breeding, but that as limited and that is not enough, and therefore a point where, for example, if you read Anderson, he says how war bought tribute, land, tribute, and slaves bought tribute, land, and supplied material for the war. And how this kind of became a kind of basis in terms of the expansion of the empire and the productive engine of this discovery in terms of slave social formation was fed by these waves and waves, as it were. And then came a moment where 2 centuries after Pax Romana, first they tried to get slaves from the border in terms of their relationship with the groups that were their ethnic groups on the outside. And then came a point when they started infiltrating into the army. And that's another process in terms of the transition that one can talk about, but that's not what we are doing today. And so one sees that, that maybe the question of in the later Roman Empire in the period in the 4th, 5th century, the choice of the birth becomes a very important site of, in fact, procurement of slaves. But for Anderson, right, Anderson talks about, as I just talked about it, how, there is a closure of the borders and that period. Then there is a gestation period when it continues to kind of grow, and then there becomes a sharp fall, and then there is a change. The colonial, you read, for example, writings by, there's Bloch, there's many other scholars who've talked about, Rostovzev, etc., etc. And then that is the change that one can talk about in terms of the transition. What we see in Rome, in the Roman law, for example, is the concept of, absolute private property that then becomes. So if in law, in legal terms, in the Greek world, we talk about a law of hybris. In the Roman world, we see the law in terms of a concept of absolute private property that distinguishes between mere possession or control over goods and what constitutes property and full legitimate rights. And therefore, this distinction between, what is between slaves who are considered articulate tools and animals, and that as then, the right of the owner. And we do know that, there were slave collars, there were, on the collars, things written, there were chains to hold them back. And it is only after the period of Constantine that you begin to see that some of these things get to be made illegal. and the treatment meted out to the slave and becomes somewhat less brutal. But we do know that there was a law. There was a law against killing of a slave, except for except if there was a threat that the slave posed to the owner, or as punishment, or else I mean, you have a law that is talking about this. Again, strangely, for a people and a community who are devoid of all rights. In the Roman world, too, there were slaves who were very skilled, um, uh, who cost a lot, and they were very cheap, ordinary slaves. Grammarians, satirists, astronomers, etc. Some a very very accomplished slave would cost something like 700,000 sesterces, while an ordinary a worker would cost something like 300. Uh, you know, uh, Within about 5 years, it was possible for a slave owner to recover from the labor of the slave the cost of a slave. So it was not very expensive to buy slaves. And after owning, after having cattle, the next most important thing that people would think of owning would be a slave, right? This began, of course, from the Greek times. But in Rome, what's very significant and important is also the evidence of manumission of slaves, and larger number of documentary evidence of manumission of slaves. And so the aspiration of the slave to secure freedom, uh, which manumitted to be freed from slavery by the owner. Many of this happened on the death of the owner. Some of this happened as a reward that the owner kind of made for his slave, and yet others happened when the owner felt very happy, and then he kind of let his slaves be free. One very important slave, who has uh, left a memorial behind and who became a very important baker of Rome is Marcus Eurysaces, for example. There are very many other examples. I've just kind of taken one because we are short of time, and I would like to sum up and have a discussion as well. And we also have slave rebellions in Rome, and three very large scale rebellions happened in the late Roman Republic. One, of course, in Sicily in the period between 135, 132, the other 104, 101 BC, and the third one that swept through Italy in the years 73, 71 BC, which is famously known as the Spartacus Revolt. There's a film on this, and you can kind of see that to see what was the plight of the slave, and how much daring, what a dare the Spartacus's revolt was, as it were. It in fact took Crassus 2 years and 4 wars to in fact defeat Spartacus. Now, slave rebellions were not taken kindly to. I mean, there are stories of Emperor Hadrian, and how he kind of felt bad about the treatment meted out to a slave, etc., etc. But brutality to any kind of rebellion was a given, and particularly this major rebellion resulted in 12,000 slaves being crucified and buried on the Appian Highway between Rome and Capua. And this has therefore, I mean, when you crucify so many of them on that highway between Rome and Capua, very important route, it is kind of setting an example for others not to dare to rebel. And this was practice that if there was one slave who revolted, then they ensured that they took to task the entire lot, or kill them all, or punish them all. This was also something that was practiced. The other very important rebellion that is also mentioned is of when the slaves revolted under Eunice. who declared himself the leader and crowned himself, but he was also ultimately killed. Now, so slave rebellion was important, and slaves, for example, when they escaped, uh, there are also stories of slaves escaping by this time. For example, one example that I mean, there's also there in Perry Anderson is Bulla Felix, who in fact is said to have sent a message to the Emperor Severus. Feed your slaves so that they don't turn to brigandage, right? And there are cases of Roman slaves murdering individual masters, after which all slaves present in the household were also eliminated, so as to send a signal that there was no violation of the decorum of what was the master-slave relations. And as we do know that the slave to desire to be a master, and so it was not that the slave wanted to be free and to be a democrat. The stories that we hear is of how powerful, how they too owned slaves, how they too owned land, and what they left behind. There would be other stories too, of the other kind too, but we need to kind of read them and hear them as well. So there's also stories about how masters gave slaves, when they were very happy with them, rewards in the form of what is called peculium, Pecuilum. And the slave collected this peculium, and then after a point, he purchased his freedom from the master. And this purchasing of freedom is something that scholars talk about as something that becomes part of the later period when the economy, that there are problems, etc. But more importantly, peculium becomes the route map for the slave to secure freedom. And after securing freedom, it is mentioned that the enslaved who now becomes free continues to keep a relationship with the family, and that becomes the basis of the patron client relation of a new form of as it were. Why? Because we know that domestic slaves became part of families, and in the families they were also integrated, and even and some of them were left behind inheritance. Some, they were part of all the activities in the home, and so even after they were free, some of them went back to keep in touch, and of course others went on to become very important people, as it were, and some of them also lived ordinary lives. Now this in sum is Greco-Roman slavery for you. Whatever little I have been able to manage in 1 hour and 10 minutes, because I was told that we will have 20 minutes of conversation. In sum, we can say that to be a slave is to be a property of another. Slave became the instrument of production. Slavery in the early world of Greece was limited. Yes, 3 to 5 slaves is something that was a dream, and that then becomes part of the classical Greco-Roman civilizational world. That was a dream of ownership, but then that is one sees the evidence of a slave social formation and economic formation in large terms significantly by the Roman period. But when we say a large social formation based on slavery, it does not mean that other forms of labor did not exist. Scholars are now suggesting 15 to 20 to 25% of labor is coming from slaves. If you read Scheidel, right, and his work, you get, and also the other scholar that I just mentioned now, Noel's work also talks about these numbers, as it were. And so the debate about numbers, the debate about gender, the debate about how slaves were nurtured in a period of crisis, post the period of war, or even prior to the period of war, how the comfort of nurturing slaves who you were familiar with, whose characteristics you were comfortable with, all this played a significant role. And slavery as an institution, the guidelines on the basis of which slavery was regulated by laws of the land, protecting the land owners of slaves, exactly like people were protected of their property of land, and so runaway slaves could be brought back. And we do see that it's when we talk about slavery in America later, it is only with the underground railroad and the way in which they were taken to safety and to security in the industrial north that we begin to see a challenge of slavery. But otherwise, the recovery of slave and their being beaten black and blue and their being chained, etc., becomes part of slavery later too in the world of in the new in the in slave America. But in Rome too, we see that they had collars, they had chains. Later, chains were given up, but then they were kind of branded, and so the ownership of uh, the ownership of the slave, the fact that he was a slave, or she was a slave, was something that was visible, and therefore was to be returned to the owner, kind of system or apparatus of apparatus of governance was in place. So slave rebellions were the aberrant, were the challenge of the system, and that is something that we see only towards the later period. And then, of course, we see, the challenge also resulting a lot of bloodshed. And then, of course, the change in the system of organizing production on account of the very many contested changes that then becomes the shift from the world of antiquity to the age of colonate, via the colonate or otherwise the period of serfdom, and that long period of the end of the world of antiquity and the beginning of feudalism is something that is another area that one can study. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Warrier, for this fascinating lecture. I see that the hands are raised already. The participants are also encouraged to either put their questions in the chat box or use the raise hand feature to ask your questions to ma'am themselves. Anindya, over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your lecture. Ma'am, I have two questions actually. One is very much related to what you say, and one is a link to that. The one related to that is you mentioned about the impact in the relationship of Christianity with slavery. My question is more in the light of the two schools of Christianity, which is Catholic and Protestants, and how they looked at slavery differently. Uh, uh, because one of the arguments that I had read was that there was a difference in the way they had looked in the light in terms of slavery, and that was one of the reasons of their difference. So was it that, or that they have looked it differently? That was my question number one. And question number two is more related to India. In that, in ancient India, we find this term dasa, das or dasa, as one of the important aspects in Vedic literature or in other areas. Can that be looked into the light of this slavery aspect, or how that stands in terms of when we look at relative to the Greco-Roman slavery?
Yeah, I'll take the two questions one after the other. I'll take your second question first because it's easy, because I really cannot kind of get into that because I'm not an ancient India specialist, nor am I a Greco-Roman history specialist. I'm just a very, ordinary college teacher who has taught this paper for very many years, and therefore am familiar with the historiography and the debates here. But your first question, that I'd like to kind of make 2 points. One, that we are talking about the period much before Christianity became these very many denominations, Catholics and Protestants. We're in fact talking about the period when, in fact, Rome, which was supposed to have looked at Christianity with suspicion, then then absorbs Christianity and becomes part of the, the formation of early Christianity in the Western world, so to speak. So that's the phase that we are talking about. And here, what I'm trying to say is that, slavery as anathema, not acceptable to Christianity, and therefore that is one reason why, slavery becomes something that is uncomfortable, is something that earlier scholars used to talk about. What I'm trying to, so that's not something that I talked about in great detail today. I was trying to say that, there are scholars who in fact say that there were to kill a child, there would have been a lot of relationships between slaves and elite men, non-elite men, owners of slaves, and with Christianity, to kill the child was something that was not there. So to have the child and then to give away the child, and that child is becoming a slave child, becomes something that becomes practice, and that is something that Harper is talking about, Noel is talking about. That's something that was not there in earlier writings, and to me that's an interesting gender dimension and social dimension in terms of the change that comes with Christianity, in terms of how instead of killing, because killing the young, right? For example, now that abortion is not something that is acceptable in very many parts of the world. Now that was not something that was the case till recently. Now if that is the case, so when Christianity was beginning at this time also, to have the child, and even if you don't want to keep the child, to give the child away, and that could then become a slave child, is something that these scholars are talking about, which to my mind was a very interesting construct. How deep it is, I really do not know, but it's a very interesting area of engagement that scholars are making, which I just wanted to kind of bring to your notice. I hope I have addressed your question.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, you did.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Nandya. Anamika ji, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Professor, for the very, very enlightening conversation, because we kind of try to put the word slavery into our understanding of this century and last century slavery. But of course, the context was completely different. Ma'am, I have a question more towards Indian context. So, when Alexander the Great came to India, do we have any documentation or paper about the slavery which was prominent in his troop, or otherwise he saw here? Is there any comparison? Also, the other question is the gender difference. Do we have documentation and details of any gender differences or gender positioning of that period of time?
Exactly. I mean, I cannot really tell you, Anamika, that's a very good question you have, but you should ask somebody who's an ancient Indian historian. I'm not competent to give you such details
Uh,
about slavery in India,
Ma'am,
but
it is not about slavery in India. I am more talking about the people and the troop of Alexander the Great. So, do we have any documentation who all came with them?
I
And
wouldn't know about that. I haven't studied that. I am just looking at Greco-Roman slavery, and for Greco-Roman slavery, there, I what is that is what towards the end I was trying to say, that in Keith Hopkins' work, conquerors and slaves as coming from those waves and waves of expansion and the securing of what earlier would be called prisoners of war, slaves as it were, apart from the slave markets. That, for example, Delos, the island of Delos, was a very important site of slave sale and purchase, to the tune of something like 10,000 slaves being sold every day. Okay, so there was a system of a market for slaves, a procurement mechanism for slaves. Wars brought slaves, and that was a machinery that was very well oiled. But yes, Anamika, that what one is also talking about is that the gender of the slave, you see younger women not being manumitted while they were in the reproductive age. That is something that these scholars are picking up. The scholar that I just mentioned, Kyle, right? The work that I just talked about, slavery in the late Roman world, Kyle Harper. Okay, you can read it. It was published in 2011. It's available in new Google Books, and you can look at it. you can look at it in a library close to you. Okay, so there she's talking about the gender dimension. She's talking about how women in the reproductive age were not so easily manumitted. And there are figures that she's citing for it. And most of the slaves that who are being who are manumitted are older, okay, or are men. And that there is a substantial number of women slaves. Now, that is a gender dimension of slavery, to my mind, that's very interesting. In the period post-Pax Romana, where you're not getting slaves, from waves and waves of wars, but you need to kind of look for an engine of reproduction, which probably then became a very important part of keeping the system going, possibly, question mark. I hope I have answered your question, Anamika.
Yes, ma'am. I wanted some direction towards reading more about it, probably, and I will read the research and the book you have mentioned,
Yes,
and I'll
you can DM me. My number is 9717 624 777. You can take it from,
I will take it from Chandni later on, ma'am, and I'll get in touch with you once I track the book and I read about it, because I'm very curious about this idea of gender identity at that point of time. Thank you so much. It was a very enlightening lecture, Professor. It made me ask a lot of questions inside my mind and relook at the idea of slavery. Thank you so much.
you're most welcome. My pleasure.
Thank you, Anamika ji. Thank you, Shobhana ma'am. We have a final question from Yash. Please, we are nearing the end of the lecture, so if you have any questions, please use the chat box or the raise hand feature. Yash asks, ma'am, will it be fair to say that Christianity had a moderating influence on the institution of slavery and was also a major factor in its abolition?
Well, that is one set of arguments about it that is there. And you can read a lot around it, particularly in the period post 4th century AD. But then that can only be one of the factors, right? Cannot be. And it's not, in early writings, it was seen as the factor, but it's no longer held to be the factor.
Yash, you may unmute and open your camera and ask your question directly.
Ma'am, is there something to the argument that because Christianity respects the sanctity of human life, uh, then it was bound to happen that institutions so inhumane like slavery was bound to get abolished because basically of Christian tenets.
See, I mean, this is a very early phase that we are talking about, 3rd, 4th century AD. That's just when Rome has, accepted Christianity.
Mm.
Constantine and his acceptance of Christianity. Yes. And then there is a whole, I mean, it's a long period between this acceptance of Christianity and the transition. Yeah.
Okay. But will it be fair to say that it had something to do with those tenets because they respect the sanctity of human life so much?
Yes, I told you, right? For example, it is the sanctity of human life that made a whole lot of children born out of wedlock, in relationship, illegitimate relationships between, slave masters and women were slaves who were then given off to slave breeders. That's one angle that one can see. Beyond that, I really don't know, how much more one can kind of say. Yes, of course, religion would play a very important role, but also remember, you know, uh, until Constantine adopted Christianity, um, the Romans looked at Christianity as pagan, and then after that they looked at everything else as pagan post the adoption of Christianity, right? So you don't look at everything. I'm not in competent to really make a comment fully on this, but I could kind of discuss this at some other point in some more detail.
Okay.
Thank you, Yash. Anamika ji, you have your hand raised. Would you like to ask your question?
No, Chandni, I'm sorry. I forgot to lower my hand. So sorry.
No worries. Jitu, please go ahead.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you so much for your lecture. Again, I'm completely new to this topic, so I'm going to ask you some basic question. So you mentioned, yeah, like you were saying, children were being born and then they would be, by birth only, they would be slaves. So could you tell us a bit about their lives? So from what age would they consider them? Like, I mean, from what age would they start working or whatever they're meant to be doing?
See, Jitu,
Yeah,
this is not something on which I can give you any data. I am also reading
Mhm.
from this new work that has come, which is saying that, that birth as a way of getting slaves rather than conquest and, trade as also another very important source, and how these records are giving evidence about slave traders as in fact getting these children. Why? Because killing children is something that is unacceptable post the Constantine thing, right? The fact that you are moving towards Christianity, and that change has happened. But I really wouldn't be able to tell you, because a lot of scholars who look at Christianity and the abolition of slavery and all that, but if you really look at Christ himself, and I mean, figuratively speaking, if you look at Christianity, how it comes up, that also was, it's not like as if it came up so easily in the Roman regions. Yeah, it's a period of struggle and then it comes up, isn't it?
Okay. And the other part, I remember somewhere in between your lecture, you were mentioning how some slaves were also, say, astronomers, or like they were, they had certain qualifications. So, was there any education, like were people who was
Yes,
educated in
yes.
some manner?
Slaves were highly educated, highly accomplished. So,
So then
I
they
mean, when
get,
we think of slaves, we think of people down and out, right? But in the Greco-Roman world, we are talking about how, Greece, which was basically a village society, an archaic society, becomes a polis civilization. And then, you know, there are captive slaves, there are slaves that are bought and sold, and then we have household slaves, we have accomplished slaves, and we have very, very ordinary slave like, I mean, extremely drudgery activity kind of slaves, those who work in the mines, as it were. Okay. Similarly, in the Roman context too, you have gang slavery, and you also have very accomplished slaves, very skilled slaves. Okay. And some of these skilled slaves, I mean, some of the slaves, when they walk on the streets, nobody would be able to identify that they are slaves, because it's not the color of the skin, it's not how they look, nothing kind of is a giveaway. Any one of us could have been slaves in those times, right? Every Greek feared being captured and being made into slaves, right? So that was the phase. So there was no color divide, there was no race divide. Slavery was basically the reducing of a human being to a property of another, being made into an instrument of production, and this as a systematic order of organizing production, right? And therefore, the concept of slave mode of production, the concept of slave social formations, as scholars have kind of talked about it. And there's debate about that as well. I hope that's clear.
yeah. Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are at the last minute of the lecture. Any question, ma'am? Ma'am, can I ask a quick question, if possible?
Yes, please.
Ma'am, if we were to compare the Greco-Roman model of slavery with the slavery that existed in the early modern India, can we say that they were a little more closely aligned? Because we do see intelligent people becoming slaves when they're coming in from Abyssinia. We see highly talented people like Iltutmish also being former slaves, Qutbuddin Aibak also being slaves. So can we say that these
Talking about various kinds of bonded labor, right?
yes,
We
ma'am.
have bonded labor, we have indentured labor, you know, it's also forms of servitude, forms of lack of rights. And that's what I said, that even as a subject society, when the British were ruling us as a colony, we had laws made, right? Laws made for a people who were colonial subjects, right? That's the contradiction. But but you also had laws where, as indentured labor, you would be taken, your passports would be seized, and it's only when you were coming back home you would get it all back, and you would then come. And the kind of all labor actually became subjugated in whether it is in plantations in colonial India, whether it is in factories, whether it is in mines. So there were other forms of subjugation. We don't call it slavery, we call it other forms of bondage. There is a spectrum of servitude. They are free, but yet kind of devoid of rights. And it is those rights that legislation in terms of the Factory Acts brought into being that began during the colonial self.
Thank you, ma'am. Jitu, last question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. No, just in continuation of this only. So can we say, ma'am, that slaves with education were leading a much more dignified life, say, as compared to slaves without, like, say, maybe they were working in mines, the ones without education, and then could you say, in any sense, dignified in No,
No, you cannot. Slaves were, they are the few slaves, the ones who are the chosen, the accomplished. They are the exceptions, right? They are the exceptions. As a rule, the slaves were devoid of rights. They were the property of the master. The master could also kill them in anger, right? I told you, for example, just because a slave killed a master, all the slaves in that house were put to death, those who saw it, because those who saw it will kind of possibly become potential attackers of masters. So that could be, in some senses, subverting the master-slave relationship, the ideological power of the master, which was challenged by the slave. And therefore, as an answer to prevent any such violation on the part of slaves, even that imagination to be kind of eliminated, these slaves were all to death, right? On the Appian Highway, the fact that, they were crucified so that you can see. So that's setting an example. And therefore, nobody will dare to challenge. Okay, so once you set an example, then it becomes an order. And then that creates an orderliness. Therefore, kind of preventing resistance of any kind.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Jitu, and of course, thank you very much, Dr. Warrier, for this very, very fascinating lecture. Greco-Roman slavery is something that all of us don't usually read about, and your lecture has given us a sort of a stepping stone, a foundation to look more into this aspect of history. So thank you very much, ma'am, for taking out time for us and then answering our questions. Dear audience, this brings us to the end of this guest lecture. The next lecture that we have on Tuesday would be about the Vijayanagar Empire. That would be led by one of our team members at Karwaan. So we'll see you on Tuesday at 9 p.m. Till then, please join me in thanking Dr. Shobhana Warrier for the lecture. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Most welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Ishan and team. Good night.
Good night, ma'am.